Hi and welcome. We're now looking at gender dysphoria, and this is in part 1, and we'll look at sexual dysfunction in part 2. Now, it's important to bear in mind that our attitudes towards sexual activity are incredibly diverse. I mean, whether you look at it around the world, or even in North America, or again in Canada. And so, what is normal is clearly influenced by socio-cultural factors. And so sexual behavior is labeled as abnormal when it deviates from the norms of one society. It may also be labeled as abnormal if it's self-defeating, harms others, or causes personal distress and interferes with one's ability to function in that society. Now, it's really important that a few things bear in mind. One, this was from chapter 1, so this is how we look at all psychological disorders with these kinds of conditions. But the other component that's really important to note is that sexual behavior is really largely influenced by social cultural factors. So what is considered normal in one culture may be considered abnormal in another. And in fact, what is considered abnormal today could be viewed as quite normal in the future. And so it's the way that society defines what is normal and abnormal, where it fits within this scale or this condition of does it fit within the norms of society. Okay, so what we're going to look at is the types. When we talk about gender dysphoria, we're going to look at the theories, and we're going to look at treatment. All right, so let's get started on this chapter, and I hope you enjoy it. Gender identity, which is one's psychological sense of being either male or female. Now, when we consider in the DSM-5 gender dysphoria, this was formerly known as gender identity disorder. This is a disorder in which the individual believes that his or her anatomic gender is inconsistent with his or her psychological sense of being male or female. Now, gender dysphoria pertains to people who find their anatomic gender to be a source of persistent and intense distress. Now, it's important here, like with all other psychological disorders, we may have elements or pieces or parts of certain things that we go, oh, geez, that's kind of like me, but it needs to be persistent and intense distress. It has to be something that causes you an awful lot of grief, not just something that passes through our mind from time to time, but we go about living our day-to-day life. People with the disorder may seek to change their sex organs to resemble those of the opposite gender, and many undergo gender reassignment surgery to accomplish this purpose. Now, if you probably have been more aware in the media of some examples of gender reassignment. Cher's daughter, Chastity Bono, in 2011 made a transition from female to male. Bono has gender identity disorder and has undergone the hormone and surgical procedure to transition from female to male. Jenna Telkakova was a Miss Universe candidate in 2012. She finished in the top 12 of 62. And Bruce Jenner, of course, and Caitlyn Jenner. Bruce Jenner was a famous Olympic champion in the decathlon, and of course you've been maybe familiar of Caitlyn Jenner when he's made his transition. Of course, these individuals are more famous. There are many others not so famous who also pursue gender reassignment. Now, if you think about the theory behind it, like what might be the reasons that this might occur, there's a number of different possibilities, but we're only going to look at a couple focal points here, and that is one around psychodynamic. They consider either extremely close mother-son relationships or detached absent-father relationships as being instrumental, thus fostering strong identification with mother, identity and behavior in the males, or in girls, a weak and or ineffective mothers and strong masculine fathers may develop stronger little men identities and behaviors. Now remember, psychodynamics and Freud's traditional format, you'll see this run through this particular chapter a bit, especially in psychological dysfunction, sexual dysfunction, is this relationship between childhood trauma and his psychosexual stages. Now, some of that work, in particular psychosexual stages, hasn't got a lot of good, strong support research-wise, and so it brings into question some of the more traditionalists in the psychodynamic explanation for either gender dysphoria and certainly within sexual dysfunction. When we look at learning, it has a similar focus where socialization patterns have a big effect, but not as the sole responsible feature in the development of gender dysphoria. To better understand this, you can read on 321 the story of Bruce, a young man from Winnipeg, and through his story, you'll understand that there's more than just socialization, the way that you are raised or the way that you're parented in the development of gender dysphoria. We need to consider the biological dispositions that might be underlying, that consider the gender brain and the role of sex hormones when we explain gender dysphoria as a theory. Now, also within this category of gender dysphoria and looking at sexual dysfunctions, we can look at what's known as paraphilia. And there's different types of paraphilia. Paraphilias are sexual deviations involving patterns of arousal to stimuli, such as non-human objects, for example, shoes or clothing, humiliation or the experience of pain in oneself or that of a partner, or in the interest in children. Now, some people diagnosed with paraphilia can function sexually without the paraphilic object, and some cannot. Some people with paraphilic disorder are men. Most people with paraphilic disorder are men. Women may have been overlooked in the research, not to suggest that women don't experience paraphilia. Not all paraphilia is bad. You know, it's socially something that you may not share and talk about with everybody, but you may find that some of them are a part of what consenting adults would participate in as a part of some sexual experience. Now, when we look at the kinds of variations, one is known as exhibitionism. This is the recurrent and powerful urge to expose one's genitals to unsuspecting strangers. Now, there's no interest in contact. Persons exhibiting don't have an interest in then further going to contact and touch you. Most of it is just the act and the response that the act gets. Now, a large group of paraphilias what are known as fetishistic disorders, and fetishisms are reoccurring and powerful urges and fantasies involving inanimate objects like clothing, or body parts like feet, or situations involving sight, smell, or feel. Now, on pages 224 and 229, you'll find some additional information on fetishes and the explanation for them. Another form of paraphilia is what's known as transvestic fetishism. Now, this, of course, is not this is from a movie called Rocky, the Rocky Horror Picture Show, and that's Rocky. But this is the recurrent and powerful urges and fantasies to cross-dress for the purpose of sexual arousal. Now, this is not the same as gender dysphoria, and it's a really important distinction, is that men are typically heterosexual and are not considering themselves women when they participate in transvestic fetishism. The interest is in the clothing. The interest is in the sexual arousal that they have within that experience, and they are typically heterosexual. They're not questioning whether they are men or women. Voyeurism, this is where urges and fantasies involving the act of watching unsuspecting people while they either undress, are naked, or engaged in sexual activity. The person either acts on these urges or is very distressed about having the urges or fantasies in the first place. Now, again, their interests aren't to make contact, but to watch unsuspecting, to do it serendipitously. Frauderism is a rather one that you may not have thought of, but maybe have experienced without being aware. This is the urges and or fantasies involving rubbing against or touching non-consenting persons. And then the image that I've shown here is kind of in a crowded situation is what often happens. This is not to say that everybody that's touching you in a crowded environment has a fetish to be in close proximity. However, for some, that's the circumstances they will search out. And then, of course, a very difficult one for many people is pedophilia, and this is the recurrent and powerful urges and fantasies involving sexual activities with prepubescent children. Now, some of the paraphilia are essentially harmless, such as fetishisms. Others, such as pedophilia and sexual sadism, often harm non-consenting victims. Now, the development of persistent sexual offending against children, you'll see this in Figure 9 on page 327 as a sort of a model of pathways. There's two pathways, essentially, either through an antisocial personality is one pathway towards, and sexual attraction to prepubescent children, or pedophiliac. The presence of both these indicate a very high likelihood that the person will offend against children. Now, continuing on with paraphilia, and I've mentioned one of these sort of paraphilias before or already, and that is of sexual masochism, the sexual urges and fantasies involving receiving humiliation and pain, either acted on or is distress about these urges and fantasies. Now, in amongst that is hypoxophilia. Now, this is also known as autoeroticism and asphyxiation. This is the arousal through the restriction and deprivation of oxygen, and it's very risky. There have certainly been deaths associated with this sort of paraphilia. Sexual sadism, now as it differs from machoism, is around the urges and fantasies are involving, in this case, sexual sadism, inflicting humiliation and pain on a sexual partner, as opposed to sexual machoism, where it's about receiving humiliation and pain. Sadomasochism is the sexual activities that relate between partners involving gaining gratification by inflicting and receiving pain or humiliation between the two people. There are many other paraphilias and many varying ones. But if we're thinking about in terms of theory as to where do these come from, paraphilia may be caused by the interaction of a few theoretical perspectives, including biology, psychological factors, and social factors. Now, what's difficult with paraphilia is that it's difficult to treat because it's compromised by the fact that most people with these disorders don't wish to change. So what we'll do, though, is we're going to start with psychodynamic. And again, we're using Freud. Now, with some of Freud's theories, they're very speculative and controversial, in this instance utilizing his Oedipal complex. Now, there is a body of work that he did using what he called psychosexual stages. And it's controversial in that it wasn't really well researched in a good scientific method, so it's not something that is well grounded. However, it is still used by traditionalists. Looking at childhood experiences, though, can have some impact. Now, learning, on the other hand, some objects or activities become inadvertently associated. Now, the association is through what you're seeing here is a conditioning. With a sexual arousal, then the object or the activity can later elicit that sexual arousal. It's not any different than the dog that automatically salivates to a bone, and then you link it with a bell, and then eventually you can remove the bone and the dog will salivate to the bell. Sexual paraphilia may be associated in that same way, that those things get linked or gets associated. It's also thought that some of the stimuli can become eroticized or generated out of childhood through observational learning. Now, lastly, we'll touch base on treatment. Now, with treatment in paraphilia, it can be caused by the interaction, again, of biological, psychological, and social factors. To touch base quickly on psychodynamic, it attempts to bring the childhood sexual conflict into awareness in order to resolve them with our adult eyes. So rather than keeping childhood experiences in a childhood framework, the more up-to-date, current psychodynamic theorists will look at some of those background childhood experiences and bring them into an adult awareness. Behavior, well, they use adverse conditioning, electric shock, for example. However, this is not helpful to bring about an adaptive alternative to replace the former response habit. So if I have a particular fetish and we're using this treatment of electric shock, what it's not teaching me is a more healthy or a more positive or an alternative behavior to help me exercise my sexuality. It's just getting rid of one. So it has a bit of a weakness that way. With biology, we often are using SSRIs. Prozac as an example for things like voyeurism and fetishism. Since SSRIs have been effective with obsessive compulsive disorders, the researchers are beginning to think that there's a relationship between fetishes and obsessive compulsive disorder. Now, efforts, like I mentioned before, are made difficult to treat paraphilias, and because people generally don't want to participate and don't want to change them. Now, in your chapter is a section on sexual assault. Now, I'm not including it here, not because it's not important, but because it's not a part of the DSM-5. Although it's, it's an important topic, it's not a psychological disorder. And so it's not, I'm not including it, or I'm not including it not because it's to diminish the seriousness of what sexual assault is. I just don't think we need to add some things that isn't a part of what is a psychological disorder. Okay, so we are done on this chapter portion on part 1, and you'll find part 2 posted as well. Enjoy. Good luck, everybody.